Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Wabandato. I'm a program officer at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. We have been doing these town halls for about a year and a half. The idea behind the town hall format is to make sure that as we go through and learn about various topics on Indian land ownership, that it gives you the opportunity to ask your questions, to listen to what some of the experts have to say on various topics. Tonight we'll be addressing valuations and appraisals, but especially delineating what the difference is between an appraisal and a valuation, how those play out for land transactions in Indian country. Tonight we're going to be joined by Tim Hansen and Greg Powell from the Appraisal Valuation Services Office. If you guys would go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Tim Hansen. I'm the director of the Appraisal and Valuation Services Office, and I'm located in Denver, Colorado. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight.
And I'm Greg Powell. I'm the regional director under Tim for the West region. I've got responsibility for the West Coast plus Alaska and Hawaii. And I'm currently living in Phoenix, but I'm this week up in Alaska. So glad that I can have the opportunity to help out here tonight and hopefully answer some questions for everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. Kind of cutting in a little bit there, Greg. I think that's you and not me, but
it could be me because I am having some technical challenges up here.
All right.
So
tonight we've got a slightly different format. I know a lot of times you'll see talking heads. We'll kind of bounce between those two, but Greg and Tim have prepared a PowerPoint. And again, I want to comment that will be added to the resources at the end of this month's posting. I'll put at about 5-10 minutes after the presentation starts. I'll make sure to get those resources out there for you so that you'll be able to take those with you and look at them as we go through tonight. Having said that, I know that Tim is going to begin the presentation, so let me get that shared with you. All right, Tim, and then you just need to let me know when to proceed.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it very much. Again, thank you for the invitation to come meet with you. There may be some of you on the call that I saw at Mystic Lake a few months ago at the conference. That was a great opportunity to have some FaceTime with tribal land staffs, and I really appreciate that opportunity as well. What we wanted to talk about tonight primarily is there's a lot of terminology going around about the differences between appraisals, valuations, and evaluations, and what that means for work we do in Indian country. And I will say we support 5 different bureaus, and BIA is one bureau that we support. BLM, Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service are the other bureaus that we provide valuation support for. And these terminologies come up also with the other bureaus besides BIA. And then we also, as you're all well aware, we fund through Tribal Shares the appraisal programs for the tribes authorized under 93-638. So these are not just specific to Indian country. These are appraisal terms of art that you'll see various places, and even in the lending industry, this is kind of creeped in there as well. So the three terms we wanted to talk about specifically tonight were appraisal, valuation, and evaluation. And it makes it especially confusing because sometimes the definitions include the other terms as part of the definition. So it's like, well, how do you tell the difference? So Free Dictionary defines appraisal as the act or process of assessing the value or price. Well, what is a valuation if it's not assessing the value or price? Appraisal is also defined as I'm sorry, I did that backwards. Valuation is the act or process of assessing a value or price, and appraisal is like an official valuation according to one definition. And an evaluation is just determining what the value of something is. So that doesn't really tell us anything either. as far as what the differences are. So Jim, if you could hit the next slide real quick. So I think you're probably all fairly familiar with the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice for all licensed appraisers. This is kind of the Bible of how to perform ethically and establish a set of standards that goes across the entire appraisal profession. And they touch on this a little bit. Appraisal, very similar, act or process of developing an opinion of value. But then it starts to spread out a little bit. Now, evaluation service is something that's not an appraisal, but it can be performed by an appraisal or by others, or by appraisers or others. And then appraiser practice is something other than an appraisal. Sorry, I'm having trouble with those words tonight. Appraisal that an appraiser does. So an appraiser may be hired to do evaluation, but if he's not, giving you a specific value, it may not be an appraisal. It may be a consultation. It may be something other than an appraisal. So USPAP sort of gets us there, but it doesn't get us all the way there. The topic of evaluation has come up a couple times. I represent the department at the Appraisal Foundation Advisory Council, and I'm on the Appraisal Standards Board Issue Committee, which we look at changes to USPAP and emerging topics that need to be addressed in the standards. And evaluation especially is a term that's come up because a lot of lenders are now using evaluations rather than appraisals to justify, especially home equity loans or second mortgages. That's dried up a little bit with the increase in the interest rates, but it was an evolving part of the profession, and the Appraisal Foundation had discussed putting in some additional standards for evaluations, but it was decided that it wasn't necessary at the time because appraisers, if they have a license, they're bound by USPAP. If they're doing an evaluation, they still have to comply with USPAP only, not the specific appraisal and appraisal review standards. So I'm going to hit the next slide. Okay, so without getting into a really deep dive on what the appraisal standards say, because this advisory opinion 21 is where I pulled this from within USPAP. It's about 4 pages long, and it goes through in great detail what the differences are as for an appraiser when they're doing all these different types of work. So the key is is the appraiser being looked at as an appraiser. Were you hired to do the job because people know you're an appraiser? If you were, then that creates certain expectations on you under USPAP. And then the key distinction is whether you're doing an appraisal under appraisal practice, or you're doing valuation service, which is outside of appraisal practice, but still under the USPAP umbrella because it is because you're an appraiser. You still have to comply with the more general parts of the standard. Now, the Indian regulations are a little different, and Greg will get into this in a minute, where some of them specifically mention USPAP as a requirement for compliance, whether it's done by an appraiser or not. The second bullet here, evaluation service, that's where this would get into that it doesn't have to be an appraiser doing it, but if the law requires compliance with USPAP, then you still would need to comply with USPAP, even though you're not an appraiser. Otherwise, it's just strictly that appraisers have to comply with USPAP. Or if your client says you need to comply with USPAP, then you would want to comply with USPAP. So the last bullet there kind of helps, again, make this differentiation. Appraisal practice is evaluation service performed by an individual acting as an appraiser. That's kind of the key distinction right there. If you know I'm an appraiser, you hired me because I'm an appraiser, I'm acting as an appraiser, and then that's considered appraisal practice. But if I'm giving you a number, if I'm giving you a value opinion, then I'm doing an appraisal. If I'm not, then I can kind of take off the appraisal standard hat and put on kind of this valuation service hat. Even though I'm an appraiser, as long as I'm clear and not misleading, I can do other things like brokerage and property management, consulting, review, some of those types of things. I just got to make sure I know what it is you expect from me as an appraiser and what I'm doing to meet that obligation under USPAP.
Now, you had mentioned the client. Can you dive a little bit deeper into what you are trying to communicate when you say client? Because for a lot of us, I think, it's my grandmother's probate, or it's, the land I'm buying from my cousin. Can you kind of get into how that plays out for Indian country, who the client actually is in these processes?
Sure. Yeah. And that varies a little bit depending on the situation. And Greg or any of our other staff that's on the call tonight that would want to chime in, and feel free. But the client, as it's defined in USPAP, is the party who engages the appraiser through either contract or, I can't remember the last term, I'm trying to remember it from, but it's basically whoever hires the appraiser. It doesn't mean who pays the appraiser, it means who engages the appraiser. And so in a situation like where we do work on Indian trust land, our client is typically BIA. They're asking us to do an appraisal for whatever purpose they have. In Indian country, for like a probate case, as an example, like you mentioned, Jim, whoever engages that appraiser or hires that appraiser would be the client to that appraiser. So it can vary depending on the role that they're playing. Now, like if you think about like in a lending situation, usually the bank or the lender is the client for the appraiser. The homeowner that's asking for the loan may be an intended user and may get a copy of the appraisal, but the client, they aren't the client. They didn't hire the appraiser. They can't tell the appraiser. They can't give instructions. They can't tell them how they want the appraisal done. And part of that is to keep kind of a line of independence between the appraiser and whoever's hiring them to do the work. Greg, I don't know if you or anyone else would want to chime in on that. I probably butchered that, but.
Yeah, no, you've done a good job with that, Tim. I think that the critical component there is that the BIA is going to be our client for our purposes. In rare cases, primarily relating to the 93-638 program, those contract or compact tribes may also be a co-client with BIA, because BIA still has the responsibility of making a decision to approve that land transaction based on the appraisal, but that tribe may, in those limited circumstances, also be a co-client. The landowner themselves or the tribe otherwise would not normally be a client, so that role will almost always be held by the BIA. And that's just not to say anything different than what you said, but just to more than anything illustrate a little bit more of that relationship.
And so if I follow up on that again, it would be up to the client then to determine whether or not, I guess, the borrower or the land person actually gets access to the appraisal, because you had said often that they might be shared.
Yeah.
And how
So,
and again, with the Bureau being the primary, is there a right for heirs or for somebody who's participating in that land transaction to get a copy of that? Or is it something that they would have to ask for?
My experience on that issue, Jim, is that as the client, we provide a copy to the client. We provide a copy of the appraisal to the client. We don't typically provide a copy to the intended users. It's the client's responsibility to share that information. Just like if you were to go to the bank in Tim's example and request an appraisal for a loan, the bank is the appraiser's client, not you. You're an intended user. The bank will provide you with a copy of that appraisal, not the appraiser directly. That same situation, that same standard holds true in our scenario then as well. We will provide a copy of that to BIA. It will depend on the individual agency and what their practice is, in my experience at least, on whether or not they will provide a copy of that appraisal unsolicited to the intended users, or if those landowners need to come in and request to see a copy of the appraisal. That's a BIA decision. That's not an appraisal decision. So I don't know how that is handled, and I don't know if there's a consistent practice or standard in place by BIA on how they would handle that.
Okay, thank you.
This is Gabe. I got a question. My name is Gabe Sneezy. In the case of a client, when you're dealing with 638 or self-governance, now, by what Tim had explained and used well, Greg, is that the client is the one that engages the appraiser. So with that said, if it's the tribe utilizing other dollars, and they've got a lot out there for like water rights and things like that, some money for agricultural use, and there's 630 of self-governance. So they provide the instructions to the appraiser. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, the 638 program partner would be, whether it's a contract or whether it's an in-house appraiser with that tribe directly, they would be providing the appraisal instructions. In those cases, AVSO's role is limited to one of review. It's not one of appraisal, but we do have a review function there that we have to maintain.
There's always been an issue regarding that. Let me introduce myself. I used to be the director, Greg, and some other folks I know. I've been in the appraisal arena with BIA for 31 years, and also wrote the regulations, Part 162, regarding agricultural leasing. Also worked with the Cobell litigation and handling those issues over there on behalf of the department. So, with these, valuations and evaluations and what you guys are explaining, I remember we had GAO involved because the Senate Indian Sub-Affairs Committee got involved because the tribes were coming to them complaining that appraisals were taking too long. So when I was in DC, one of our charges was to assist in streamlining by maintaining the integrity of the appraisal process. For that reason, we came up with market studies and things like that we threw in there, and I had to explain to the higher ups that it all depends on the market, because they want it also for commercial use. I told them you can't do it with commercial use because it's not externally regulated, but with agricultural properties, it is. For instance, when you go to ask for a loan, you go to the cotton gin, and they'll tell you how much you can spend on rents. So it is regulated to an extent. So you can do something like that in the agricultural arena. And then with the residential stuff, I remember the issue was that a lot of these executive order reservations, it's they have residential leases, but their leases already dictated. It's $1 a year for 20 years. So what's the point in going through all that stuff? But I think the thing about it is, we have always tried to maintain USPAP and its process, and it's an integral process, which really helps to for the department to exercise the trust responsibility in Indian lands, and that's what the appraisal is for. Now, that's their function, and so you got two different type of trusts. You got the fiduciary trust, the one that's specific to an individual Indian. That's what the department has the responsibility for. Then you have public trust, Fish and Wildlife Service and things like that, where they can write a little bit more of what they want to see in there. But I think the reason why there should be some consideration with probates is it goes into that fiduciary trust, because there's somebody on their deathbed over there, and that appraisal will need to be done because it's going to go into probates. And back in the day, we had established timeframes, and we were working under the Secretary's high-level implementation plan under the Cobell litigation, that we work with probate, and they set a standard 90 days. And so we mirrored that standard, and we were able to complete our process within 90 days. And it had to do with, using a different method, but still in compliance with use path. Instead of a self-contained, you're looking at something else. And so I think a lot of the tribe right now, from what I'm hearing, is that they're complaining about the services. They're saying that, that the ADSO tells them that they don't have enough money, that they can only do 4 or 5 appraisals a year. But that is, you can do that when you're in a public trust, but when you're in a fiduciary trust, it isn't. That's a whole can of worms that's about ready to get open too, because that's their responsibility. That's what that money's there for. And appraisals under the Indian arena has a specific line item for appraisals. In the other arena, it's always been under realty. I don't know if you guys, Tim, if you guys were able to establish your own line item under Congress for that. Yeah, that's a good start.
Yeah.
And back when we were working through this, that's when they had all the different chief appraisers for all the different agencies over there: Fish and Wildlife, Recreation, Chaponi, and all those folks. They were chief appraisers, so they had come to us because we were able to consolidate the line authority under the chief appraiser, which happened to be me at that time. So they did that. They went over that, and one of the things that I had mentioned is that you got to hold the purse strings. You got to create a line item, and it's good that you done that, because what eventually happened was the realty officers got mad and said, "Okay, we'll contract out. We don't need your services anymore." And so that's how the valuation component was kind of stymied by that financial obligation. But I think there's a lot more issues here where you got to kind of have to look at history, go back and read the GAO report of 1998, and hear what the Indian Sub Affairs Committee had tasked the Bureau to do, and then under the high-level implementation plan, all the other things that we went through. But I think right now it seems like under 638 in self-governance, the tribes do have a little bit more latitude in getting appraisal for the services they're using, the funding they're using, with water rights and special agricultural funding and things like that. It's just not coming from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that's good that you guys clarified the client, that it's not the person that pays you, it's the person that engages you, and that falls right in line with 630 and self-governance. All right, well, that's my comment. Thanks.
No, Gabe, thanks a lot for that. And if you're the one that wrote the regulations, I applaud you, because the Indian country regulations do offer a lot more flexibility and when it comes to valuation. And we started to explore ways to use those things other than appraisals to get things done quicker and more expeditiously, especially ag leasing. In Oklahoma, we're piloting a couple of uses of mass appraisal techniques, some multiple regression analysis that's helping to get those agricultural leases done in a more timely manner, and able to crank out, sometimes I think the most we did was up to 501 model that was able to get those off the books very quickly. So thank you for that. And as far as the money goes, if anybody tells you we don't have enough money to do work, that's not the case. We've been successful in getting more funding, both for tribal shares and to ensure that our appraisal staff is being built back up. The one problem that we've got now is we have the money on both sides of our operations, the federal land side and the Indian side, but we don't have appraisers. The appraisal profession is aging, and it's a very challenging recruiting environment, or has been, now that the residential lending market has sort of dried up. We're getting a lot more interest in coming to work for us, which unfortunately, that's what happened in 08 and 09 when the real estate market collapsed. We hired some good appraisers at that time, but we've been successful in getting additional funding, and we have a line item both for Indian appraisals and for our federal land appraisal work. And then we've got multiple other funding agreements that are separate from those as well, with like the Bureau of Reclamation. They're not handled under the Land and Water Conservation Fund appropriation. They have their own. We do a reimbursable services agreement with them. So there's a lot of different situations. And that touches on one thing we can get on later, Jim, is about the how to become an appraiser, because we'd love to have some more appraisers on staff, especially in Indian country, where a lot of the work's done internally. And
So
another thing.
Did you
Oh,
say
go
you
ahead.
wanted to come back to that at the end of the
Or
conversation?
I can talk about it now if that's okay. And
I
then
know
Greg
we had planned to have that kind of toward the beginning,
okay, sure.
so it might be opportune time.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it now, and Greg can handle the specific regulations when we finish that up. So becoming an appraiser is not a simple thing. It takes about to become. So I don't know how familiar everybody is with the appraisal licensing requirements. They're handled at the state level. So every state has a appraisal board that issues licenses and is responsible for enforcing the appraisal standards and the appraisal rules in that particular state. To start from scratch, you'd be looking at, on top of a 4-year degree for doing non-residential work, you'd be looking at 3,000 hours of experience, 1,500 of which have to be non-residential in nature. And then about another, I think it's about 300 hours of education specific to appraisal that's outside of the college coursework, and then pass a comprehensive exam to become a certified general appraiser. We have an apprentice program in place, and our experience is it was designed to take 3 years, which is working full-time as an appraiser trainee. Reality is it takes 4 to 5 years, especially as a government employee, because you have a lot of other things that you have to do, mandatory trainings, things like that, that don't allow you to get that 3,000 hours in 3 years. It's fairly onerous, and that's one of the reasons that people have said they aren't interested in becoming appraisers, because it takes too long. I want to do something different right now when I get out of college. So that's one obstacle that we've overcome. Another one is an awareness that appraisal is a profession. I don't know how many times I talk to people and they say, I didn't realize the government has appraisers. Well, yeah, we do. We have we have 97 appraisers on staff right now across our entire organization, and looking to grow that to somewhere about 110 if we could. We just, when we've advertised jobs, we don't get even enough sometimes referred applicants for the number of vacancies we have. We are trying to work with the Department of Labor right now. We're very close to getting an agreement to have our trainee program represented or registered as a registered apprenticeship program, which will open up some additional opportunities for interns and apprentices to come on board. Again, with our challenges, and you can all appreciate this, is that we don't want to take away from our ability to continue to do work in Indian country at the expense of our apprentice program. So there's a balance that we have to strike there, and we're looking at potentially contracting out with some firms to do some of the training to kind of get the basic level of training in place for our apprentice program. But we'd hope to expand that. I've asked Greg and the other regional directors as part of our kind of our workload rebalancing to figure out how many apprentices they could take on board at any given time. And I think we're hopeful that we can increase. I think we have 4, and I noticed a couple of them might be on the call tonight, but I think we have 4 in place right now. And I think my goal would be to get that up somewhere closer to 10. I'd love to see us be able to establish a pipeline of interns or apprentices that could come in on a regular basis, and we could expect we're going to get 6 or 10 a year every year, and we're just going to kind of crank them through training and experience, and just as they get through the program, they'll work into a job, and, the next ones will come in. We'll just kind of keep this going to kind of grow the profession, at least within interior and hopefully outside of interior as well. But yeah, so it's not an easy task to become an appraiser. Another big challenge is mentorship. And I think this has come up a couple times. I think, Jim, in conversations with you about potentially some sort of, with appraisers and tribal programs, having some sort of a mentor program where they could come and get some of that mentorship from us, since we do a lot of work in Indian country, and then go back and be tribal appraisers. Mentorship is a huge issue profession wide. I belong to the Northern Colorado Association of Real Estate Appraisers, and they have on their website and in their newsletter every month, they publish a list of people that are looking for mentors that have already taken sometimes 75 or 100 plus hours of training. They've had experience as a trainee, but they can't find mentors to take them on. That's a big issue, and that's one of the really, I think, missing links in the appraisal profession as far as career development.
Yeah, now I'll share my experience with you. When I first took over as the chief appraiser in DC, we did a survey, and we're 30% or less Native Americans, and as a part of the milestones that was required for trust reform, we created a trainee position. And I tell you, it was hard. We had to beat the sticks for Native Americans, because at that time we had Indian preference. So, we're going to the different colleges, to the different tribes. And when I stepped aside, we were up to 70% Native Americans. But one thing that, I would put out there for consideration is, when you're dealing with Indian country, it's better to get Native Americans. Why? Is because Native Americans understand the uniqueness of the reservation. And a lot of times when you're talking to landowners or tribal individuals, they're a lot more talking to a native than they are non-Indians, and that helps to open the door, because some of the comparables that you find out there are on Indian lands. And, there are Native American farmers out there, ranchers out there. And so, that's something that you should consider. Plus, the other thing too is that, your region is vast now, and so when you train somebody, you should also consider what reservations that they're going to be handling. And the beauty about that too is, about being with the federal government is, as a federal employee doing appraisal work on federal lands, you don't need to contact the state. So you can go out there and do it. It's always been the position that we've taken. And in a lot of cases, states don't want to touch any type of issues on tribal lands. I've had that issue come up before too, where an appraiser got reported and the state said, nope, we have no jurisdiction on the reservation, so we cannot handle this. And that's the issue that we dealt with in a couple of cases throughout the United States. But and the other thing about natives is, I'm just sharing with you my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Is when we're regionalized like that, and at one point our appraisers used to be stationed out at the different BI agency where they're at, and most of the time when you get an Indian on there, that's where he's from. So you spend about $30,000 training somebody, he's going to stay. And your native regional appraisers that you did have out there, I don't know how many left, they all came up through the training ranks. I came up through the training ranks. Eldred Licensi came up through the training ranks, and so you have more of an individual that wants to service his people. So he wants to stay and help. In a lot of cases, I remember, when they contracted out the appraisal program to Brian Hawley at that time. That was back in, I think, the mid 2000s. You know, they were training these appraisers that were non-Indian, and they go over there, get trained. As soon as they got trained, they left. You know, when you're spending a lot of money, I remember when we had put the pencil to, it was costing us about $20 to $30,000 to train somebody. That's, you know, that's the education, that's the traveling, that's all that stuff going on. And so, you know, when you put some money like that in professionalizing somebody, you're going to want them to stay around, you know, and that's something that I hope that you would consider, especially for people in the Indian country like myself. And I see Colette on there, and Liz Dykstra. Yeah, you know, Greg came through the ranks up in Billings, Montana. And he got trained by some good appraisers over there. Many years, been doing a lot of work in Indian country, Monty Banks and those folks out there, you know, and they knew their stuff, you know, and it's good to see Greg on there. You know, he has a lot of experience, and I don't know who your other directors are, you know, if they've even done an appraisal on Indian land. Maybe they've done reviews, but actually doing an appraisal on Indian is a little bit different, you know, and you know, you got the Indian component that you have in there, but you know, we would hope that you would get somebody that really understands the type of properties you're dealing with. Is it treaty lands, allotment lands, is it executive order lands? What kind of land are you appraising? You know, and but yeah, you know, that's you know, that's good to hear that you have a trainee program, but that's some consideration, you know. I know you guys don't have Indian preference anymore, but you know, with these folks, you know, maybe you can have some kind of a consideration for them, you know, to go out there and do work in Indian country. Like I say, I remember the first time I became an appraiser, went down to Fort McDowell, and the chairman over there, you know, I was with my mentor, and he said, "Mr. Sneezy, can I talk with you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You know what? You know," and I don't say this derogatory, it's just what he told me. He says, "Good to see an Indian guy over there. All we get is hunky guys over here." But that opens the door. Yeah, it means a lot. And then when I was up in DC, I got called to the front office, assistant secretary's office. So we got a complaint from Chairman Fraser, Cheyenne River. He said, "Can you send somebody?" I said, "No, I'm going to go out there. I'll go out there myself." So flew over there, met with Chairman Fraser. First thing he says is, "You're a brown guy." I said, "Yeah, I'm Apache. I'm from San Carlos." He said, "You know, every time we write a letter to DC, they send a white guy that has no authority." I said, "I'm the director." I said, "But one thing that I'm going to tell you, we're going to agree to disagree, but that doesn't mean it doesn't stop there. I'm going to need your help." Boy, the doors opened up after that, you know, and they like that visitation from leadership out there, especially when you're dealing with chairmen, presidents, and governors. That's who they want to talk to. They don't want to talk to the staff appraiser.
Right.
You know, that's some word of advice. But yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad to hear you have a trainee program. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. I appreciate you offering your experience to our audience this evening. I do know we're getting closer on time, so we'll go ahead and we'll shift gears, if we may, to the next section. I think that's for you, Greg, or you're going to pick up more of the conversation. I moved it to the regulations.
Okay. Before I jump into this, I just want to make a couple of additional comments. Gabe, first of all, thank you for your years of service, and that's no small feat in and of itself. And then secondly, thank you for your work on the regulations. That alone is enough to make somebody go bald, let alone, you know, shorten their life. So thank you for all of your work there. The other thing that I want to point out, just on your comment there about the training program, we are actively investigating working with some of the tribal colleges about what would a training program look like, and how could we make that happen. It's very early in the discussion stages. And so I can't say much more than that, but that is an avenue that we're looking at and trying to explore to see what we can do with those direct tribal colleges to stimulate some additional interest in the appraisal organization and appraisal career, excuse me, for Native American students. So having said that, let me continue the pivot here back into the regulations. When it comes to what the regulations require, there is a clear-cut difference between what tribes can do versus what individual Indians can do. Tribes have a much greater, much broader authority on whether they can do a valuation or an evaluation versus doing a full appraisal, a standard use PAP appraisal. Under the same regulations, the individual Indians are restricted largely to only being able to have an appraisal, a market analysis, or some other appropriate valuation method, as we see here on this first slide. And although this is, yeah, go ahead, Jim.
And in saying that, then, because these are regulations, it's not statutory, that would be a matter then if Indian country wanted to change that, we would have to we would have the option to pursue regulatory change without having to go to the halls of Congress.
Yes, yes. And we've seen that approach be successful, where getting statutory changes accomplished is, you know, earth moving, mountain moving type of work. And so 169, CFR 169 is a good case in point. That one was most recently revised back in 2016 when that was released. So that one's fairly current, fairly new. And that's the most current one of all of the Indian regulations that has gone through a revision recently. I think Gabe probably was responsible for some of the other ones around 162 on leasing and those kinds of things. And we'll be touching on that one in just a second. So when it comes down to the individual Indian owner versus a tribal owner, the tribe has much greater flexibility, and it's fair to make a comparison of the tribe can do almost anything they want to, and the individual Indian can hardly do anything except an appraisal. So if you'll keep those two things in mind, that's probably a fair representation of the process and how it gets applied to tribes versus individuals. So we can go on to that next slide then. 162, which deals with the regulations around leases and permits. The fair annual rental is the market value standard that appraisers have to follow, and that can be determined by competitive bidding, appraisal, or any other appropriate valuation method. So now we start to see just a little bit nuance coming into play. Previously, it was a market analysis under 169. Now it's competitive bidding. And when you get in a little bit farther and you deal specifically with grazing leases at 166, then it even begins to add another nuance, and we'll see that on the next slide. But these still have to be done in accordance with USPAP. So if you're a tribe, you can set your lease rates, your annual rental rates, your right-of-way compensation rates. You can set those and determine those really however you want to. But if you're an individual Indian and you're needing those numbers, you've got to almost have to have an appraisal. Again, when it comes to leasing, then there's a little bit of nuance there where you can do competitive bidding versus an appraisal. Go ahead, Jim.
And we covered this a little last month in the grazing permit conversation. When it comes to the tribe setting the rates, Greg, it does not explicitly say that that has to apply to allotted lands. Is that correct? Meaning because you've got the individual involved in the process, that they still have rights against the tribe setting a valuation level that they're not happy with?
Right, as I recall, in those scenarios where the tribe may have the majority ownership on a tract, is that kind of what you're thinking about? And there's that split ownership between the tribe and individuals, with the
Right.
individuals owning a minority interest in an allotment. The
Because
tribe can
generally
set
speaking, if
whatever
I'm going
rate they want to, as long as in that case, the individual Indians get the fair annual rate. And because that's determined by an appraisal or competitive bidding, if the tribe says we'll accept $1 of an AUM, for example, for this grazing lease, but the market rate may be $10 an AUM, then they have to pay those individual Indian owners, regardless of their share of the interest, they have to pay them that fair annual rental rate. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that as we're discussing it in this context, that landowners understand that they still have rights in regard to the tribe doing things that might certainly advance Indian agriculture, but at the expense of fair market value.
Yes, good. So that next slide then, Jim. So finally, here at 166, which deals specifically with grazing valuations, an appraisal can be used to determine that. But if the landowner doesn't want an appraisal, then they can go to competitive bids, negotiations, advertisements, and any other method that can be used in conjunction with a market study, a rent survey, or feasibility analysis, as long as those things are developed in accordance with USPAP. So that's the nuance, that's the flexibility that they do give around rental rates. One of the other notes that I'd like to make is if individual Indians can opt to do a permit rather than a lease, the regs appear to give much greater flexibility around the use of permits and how those are valued than they do around a lease. If it's a lease, it requires fairly hard and fast valuation rules. If it's a permit, it appears to me, and this is only my opinion, I'm not an attorney and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but it's my opinion that there is that flexibility that if you can manage to use a permit, you might gain some flexibilities there. So you'll have to flesh that out with your BIA agency representatives to make sure that I'm telling you that accurately, but that's my understanding of the regs is that if you can do a permit, that gives you a little more flexibility. So
Great.
Yes.
On that portion that you have over there that if an appraisal is not desired, competitive bidding, negotiation, conjunction with the market study, I think that's real key. I'll just share with you some experience. Fort Hall, we had a superintendent out there, and he started the bidding process. And when it hit the appraised value, he would stop it.
Mm.
You know, and the tribes were complaining, says, my land, I can take more than the appraisal, you know, and that's, you know, it's a case where, yeah, you know, the appraisal, I used to always tell them the appraiser is just a bottom value. You can take more or less. It's up to you. You're the landowner. And then in the case of Fort Yuma, I remember in that case there, it was kind of a unique situation where the tribe was actually driving the market, you know, and up in that vegetable country, Del Monte and some of those folks were cutting back on the availability of lands. And so Kushan, you know, they didn't do that. And, you know, you seen where, you know, farmers were paying more on Indian land than off. But in that case there, what we did was we did a market study to set a high and low, and that was it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really good for to make sure that the competitive bidding is not, you know, the driving force. Because a lot of times, you know, when I used to go out there, you know, you go to the restaurants in the morning, coffee shops in the morning, you talk to the farmers, and a lot of times the farmers say, you know, I'm bidding on the Indian land over there. This is what I'm bidding. And they say, well, you know, you've been out there. We're not going to put our bid no more than that. So that's how they were controlling, what the bid price was. So, but when you got market studies and rent surveys like that, that gives the tribe as well as individual landowners a lot of latitude to what they see as to what they want to accept. So that's good. Good to see that.
Yep, I'd agree with that. Yep. Okay, Jim, I think that next slide we're ready for. So, in terms of summary, if an appraisal is required by regulation, it has to be done by an appraiser and it has to comply with USPAP. Other valuation methods may be allowed, and there's more flexibility there if they are, where they may be able to be done by a non-appraiser. One of the things that Gabe has mentioned that he started doing, and we still do around the country today, is the use of market studies, and where we'll try to bracket through the use of the market studies a high and a low, and we'll give that to the BIA. One of the pushbacks that we have seen through the years, and this isn't a blanket statement by any means, but we have seen some pushback around the idea that the BIA wants to have a point value. They don't like dealing with a range of values. They want something very specific. And so we do get some pushback when we try to use those. But at the same time, we're seeing more and more opportunities for those, and we try to use them when we can. If the valuation, even if it's not an appraisal, is done by an appraiser, that individual has to comply with USPAP regardless. And then finally, a non-appraiser can choose to comply with USPAP. However, it's not mandatory unless regulation requires it. So that's kind of the summarization of some of those kinds of things. As well as then some of the other comments that I had about the flexibilities for tribes versus individual Indians. With the tribes, we've got all sorts of latitude there built in through Hearth Act and some of those different things. So I think there's one more slide. Yeah. Okay. So this is probably a good point, Jim, if you want to circle back to that list of questions you had at the start. I'm happy to try to answer those.
Sure. All right. So we've got the one coming back about day of death, but I did have a couple. I'm hoping they're quick questions. I know we had talked about current rental rate values for agricultural lands. Is there a practical use for like tables of or ranges? It seems like everybody else has access to these things through the various online resources, but we don't really have anything like that for Indian country. Would you see that as a valuable tool? Or is it?
Yeah, certainly in some cases, we may be able to use some of that at this point in time, not as a standalone.
I'm not getting audio.
Sorry, Craig, you're talking over us there. If you can mute that. The use of those, like the National Agricultural Statistical Survey, the NASS, data that's available. We can't use that as a standalone document or a standalone value source, but we can use that to supplement thin data when we run into those situations. We don't like relying on that, but if we can use it as a supplementary source, that's very useful for us at that point. Okay. Some of the other things that may come into play, Gabe mentioned, surveys of producer surveys from other sources, like his example was, the gin operators for cotton prices and cotton rates, that kind of stuff. That would be a good supplemental source. There's not much cotton being grown in Arizona anymore, at least on Indian ground. So we're not seeing much demand for those specific rates. But out in Yuma, in that area, we are regularly polling the producers and finding out what are their rates for those non-Indian producers, so that we have something comparable to know what the market off the reservation is, to know where we're at and where our rates are in relation to the non-reservation rates. And Historically, I think we've been on the high side of that, but as Gabe indicated, there's nothing wrong with that. So
Okay.
it's a benefit. Some of
Got
that water
about a
sharing.
minute and a half or 3 minutes. So quickly, is there a different process for valuation and appraisal on restricted lands as opposed to trust?
No, it's virtually the same process.
Okay. Have you guys had a chance to look at Tim's question? Making appraisals for values. It's in the chat. It says, how are you making appraisals for values at the time of death, which may be 5 to 10 years ago? Does this take longer in, obtaining what would amount to a fair market value? And does AVSO use that type of data?
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of that, we don't determine the date of death. That's provided to us by the probate judge's orders for the appraisal. It does take longer because we're either having to go back into our old records and find the data that's appropriate to be used, or go back into the marketplace and scrounge for that data, whether talking to other appraisers that are in the marketplace or going back to the county courthouse, whatever. But it does take a little bit longer. Trying to quantify how much longer it takes is difficult, but it is more time consuming.
Okay. Tim, Greg, any last comments as we wrap up for the evening? Or any last thoughts that you want to have people remember from our conversation tonight?
Trying to get my mic turned back on. No, thank you for the invitation. And I hope, as we've talked about, Jim, that we can be more frequent participants in some of these. And I know there's a lot of questions about probate, and that might be another topic that we bring up. A separate one just on probate cases, because I know we've had some conversations with OHA and some of the judges to try and figure out what they need and what we can provide and what that looks like. And so that's an ongoing discussion. We'd be happy to come back and have a deeper conversation about probate appraisals and some of the issues that we're challenged with, and hear some of the issues that you all are challenged with. Gabe, I'd like to thank you again for your comments. Appreciate that very much. And we're here to help. I mean, seriously, we are here to help. And so if you have questions, don't be afraid to call Greg or our other two regional directors, Dave McGinnis or Kelly Underwood, or contact me. And I can get you in touch with the right people that can answer the questions. But we're sounds cliche, and it's a terrible thing to say. We're from the government, we're here to help. And I know that's not the right thing to say here, but we really do want to help. We see a lot of possibilities for a better working relationship with tribal programs and on the Indian side. And so we're very, very open to those conversations, and like to hear your concerns and what we can do to make it better. So thank you.
Hey, Tim, this is Gabe. Where can I find you?
You can find me at I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay.
And then you can send me a note, and we can take it from there. That works.
Works. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Greg, anything?
No, nothing more from me. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate the opportunity.
I appreciate everyone who joined us this evening, and I definitely want to extend a hearty thank you to Greg and Tim, as well as Gabe. Full disclosure, Gabe is actually on our ILTF board of directors as well, so we do appreciate him in many contexts. I will, in closing, highlight that our next conversation is going to be in a couple of weeks, and we're looking at tackling real estate basics once more. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.